And it's going to be very, very bad all the way west, as far west as this county goes.
Few storms etch their names into history with such brutal permanence.
You may have to fend for your life here if you are close to the bay in South Dade County.
Fewer still force an entire generation to tear up the rulebook on survival and start again.
This can only be described as total devastation.
This is Chapter 2 in our 3-part journey into Earth's rarest and most fearsome creations, the Category 5 hurricane. In all of recorded history, only 4 of these have ever struck the United States, and all but 1 have made landfall on the Sunshine State's exposed and fragile coastline. In late August of 1992, one of these monsters came roaring out of the Atlantic, leaving behind the entire landscape of southern Miami-Dade County completely unrecognizable.
This used to be all trees and shade and everybody happy.
This is the most terrorizing thing I've ever been through in my life.
This isn't just the story of a storm. It's the story of how, in just 4 harrowing hours, one hurricane rewrote the future of Florida permanently. I'm CJ, and this is Florida Man Weather. On August 14th, 1992, a tropical wave emerged from the west coast of Africa, one of many born from the seasonal conveyor belt of disturbances drifting off the Sahel each summer. It slipped into the Atlantic under the blazing Sahara sun, carried westward by the relentless mid-level trade winds. At the time, it was little more than a swirl of disorganized thunderstorms. Just another unremarkable ripple in a basin that had been notably quiet for nearly 2 years. The wave maintained a steady westward march, its low-level circulation sharpening under warm waters and high humidity. And by August 16th, it had organized enough for the National Hurricane Center to classify it as a tropical depression. Just 24 hours later, the system intensified into a tropical storm and would be given a name that would go down in infamy. Almost immediately, Andrew ran headlong into strong westerly wind shear, the byproduct of a stubborn upper-level trough lingering over the central Atlantic. The hostile shear displaced the storm's thunderstorms well east of its center, leaving the low-level circulation partially exposed on satellite imagery. And on August 20th, Hurricane Hunter's reconnaissance aircraft measured a central pressure of 1,015 millibars, a reading more suited to a summer day over Florida than to a dangerous tropical cyclone. Forecasters at the National Hurricane Center in Miami would quietly note that Andrew might not even survive the week. But meanwhile, back in South Florida, hurricane season had begun as a yearly ritual, and there was hardly a flicker of concern. Most residents saw Andrew's position far out in the Atlantic on local newscasts and returned to their lives, hardly giving the fledgling system a second glance. But out over the open Atlantic, the atmosphere was about to change. On August 21st, a powerful dome of high pressure, a sprawling subtropical ridge, began building over the southeastern United States. As the ridge expanded eastward over the Atlantic, the disruptive upper-level winds over Andrew collapsed. The vertical shear dropped to under 10 knots or around 12 miles per hour, and the air aloft smoothed into a uniform easterly flow. And below, the sea temperatures hovered around 29 degrees Celsius with high ocean heat content. The moisture-rich environment was now primed to feed deep convection. Andrew's response was immediate and explosive. Over the next 36 hours, the storm underwent one of the most dramatic rapid intensification events in the satellite era. Its eye contracted from about 35 miles across to barely 10, a tightening spiral of fury. The eye wall transformed into a perfect, unbroken ring of violent thunderstorms, their cloud tops overshooting the tropopause and venting into a textbook anticyclonic outflow pattern on satellite imagery. And by the morning of August 23rd, it was a Category 4. There was no wobbling, no sign of weakening, just an unerring march toward the northwest Bahamas, and beyond them, the southeast coast of Florida. Inside the National Hurricane Center in Coral Gables, the mood was tense but focused. Computer forecast models, still well in their infancy, had reached a rare consensus. Miami and the rest of South Florida now lay directly in the storm's path. The subtropical ridge to the north was unyielding. There would be no curve to the north and no chance for Andrew to escape. NHC Director Bob Sheets addressed the public later in the day with sober gravity.
Bob, did you ever think this was going to happen?
No, and I always hoped it would not happen, but knew the day was going to come when it would.
Right, we've talked about it many times. All right. Thank you, Bob. We'll keep going back to you as often as we can here, as long as we can.
Okay.
In Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties, evacuation orders were issued for over 1.1 million people. U.S. Highway 1 was reversed to carry residents out of the Keys. And Florida's Turnpike became a slow-moving river of headlights under a thickening overcast. Gas stations ran dry, hardware stores emptied of plywood and shutters, and bottled water became scarce. The initial shrugs and dismissals were replaced with hurried preparations, arguments over evacuation, and a growing edge in every conversation. By the morning of Sunday, August 23, 1992, Andrew's intensity had leveled off and the storm was bearing down on South Florida. As Floridians finished their final preparations, Hurricane Andrew's first feeder bands began sweeping into South Florida. Through the evening, the outer bands thickened, the wind's pitch rising and rain coming in blinding sheets with each passing squall. And as the night progressed, the air itself seemed to change. Each rush of wind rattled loose debris and bent palm trees until their fronds nearly touched the ground. And in the darkness of night, the storm continued to advance towards the South Florida coastline with mechanical precision. On Miami's radar screens, Andrew's tiny 10-mile wide eye edged relentlessly toward shore, its surrounding eye wall glowing a perfect crimson, an unbroken ring of violence. Operationally, the storm was labeled as a high-end Category 4, but to those waiting in the dark, the labels meant nothing. The hours that followed were a slow tightening of the noose. Even in its final hour offshore, Andrew was still sharpening its blade. Air Force hurricane hunters made one last punishing pass through the core, buffeted by 187-mile-per-hour winds at 10,000 feet, with gusts nearing 196 miles per hour. At 4:40 a.m. on Monday, August 24th, 1992, Andrew would make its first landfall on Elliott Key. Minutes later, the storm's northern eye wall, its most destructive quadrant, slammed into the Miami-Dade coastline. And on Miami's WTVJ, meteorologist Brian Norcross became the steady, measured voice hundreds of thousands would cling to in the night. Fully aware that Andrew's compact size meant that intense conditions would be short but catastrophic, Norcross walked viewers through preparing for and surviving their face-off with nature's ultimate fury.
Do not think that you are in any way safe if you have not hunkered down and got that mattress over you, friends. This is the time to do it. Get to that interior closet, get a mattress over your head, get your family in there, and just wait this thing out.
At 5:05 a.m., Andrews Center crossed Fender Point in Biscayne National Park, just east-northeast of Homestead Air Force Base. Official sustained wind estimates over land ranged from 145 to 165 miles per hour, with gusts to at least 175. Many measuring devices that were in the core failed instantly, leaving gaps in the record. Structural engineers later estimated Andrew's top winds were underreported by as much as 20%, with localized gusts well over 200 miles per hour. In fact, one surviving instrument recorded an unofficial 211 mile per hour wind gust before it too was destroyed. Unknown to meteorologists as they watched Andrew's fury unfold on radar, inside the wind field lurked invisible assassins. Post-storm analysis by none other than Dr. Ted Fujita, yes, that Ted Fujita, revealed what were only previously thought to be pure speculation. Dr. Fujita's analysis revealed that mesovortices, tiny tornado-like vortices riding within the eye wall's 120 mile per hour background flow, spinning at 80 miles per hour, focused the burst of near 200 mile per hour wind force onto specific buildings. It was like a giant hand picked certain houses to destroy and left the ones next to them standing. Meteorologists now believe Andrew's final burst of strength came from the land itself. As the low-level winds hit the rough coastal surface, they slowed just enough to pile up behind the eye wall, forcing more air upward and tightening the core. The result was a corridor of absolute devastation, only 20 to 30 miles wide, but in that swath, the destruction and devastation was complete. Yet, despite the storm's ferocious winds, Andrew was a bit of a paradox, a dry hurricane for most of South Florida. Thanks to a rapid forward speed of nearly 19 miles per hour, Andrew's rainfall across the area was limited to around 2 to 4 inches, with only a localized peak of nearly 14 inches in western Miami-Dade County. This spared the area from widespread freshwater flooding, and the damage that was found came almost entirely from the wind. For those caught inside, the storm became an assault on every sense. It wasn't sound anymore, it was pressure. You felt it inside your ribs. The wind became a physical vibration that shook walls, floors, and even the air in people's lungs. In Homestead, one family huddled in a bathroom, listening as their kitchen appliances were flung into walls before the walls themselves gave way. For 2.5 hours, the northern eye wall rolled inland like a mechanical shredder. Mobile home parks were scoured to bare slabs, 99% destroyed in some areas. Boats were thrown half a mile inland, wrapped around trees, or lodged into the remains of houses. Homestead Air Force Base, once a sprawling military hub, was reduced to twisted hangars, flattened barracks, and empty foundations. When the first gray light of morning revealed the scope of destruction, the view was apocalyptic. From Coral Reef Drive south to Florida City, block after block lay erased. Pilots flying over traced the looping scars of these mesovortices, thin, boomerang-shaped ribbons of absolute destruction stitched into an already entirely flattened landscape. An Associated Press dispatch would capture it without flourish. Homestead Air Force Base is gone. After carving a swath of devastation across South Florida, Hurricane Andrew did not fade away. The storm's compact core spent less than 4 hours crossing the Florida peninsula before it emerged from mainland Monroe County once more into the open waters of the Gulf at around midday on August 24th. And in front of the storm, only the warm, deep waters of the Gulf lay ahead, brimming with latent heat. Though its furious crossing of Florida had weakened Andrew to a Category 3, the storm wasted no time drawing strength from the Gulf's energy-rich waters. By the night of August 25th, satellite imagery revealed an ominous sight. Andrew's structure had reorganized, its eye wall once again wrapped around in dense, unbroken convection, and a larger, more defined eye stared back at meteorologists from the infrared loops, the hallmark of a storm regaining its power. Briefly, Andrew clawed back to Category 4 intensity as it pushed northwestward, steered by a weakening subtropical ridge. The turn toward the central Gulf Coast was now unmistakable. And by August 25th, emergency management shifted into high gear. Approximately 1.25 million people were ordered to evacuate from central and southwest Louisiana. And in New Orleans, crews raced against the clock to close 111 floodgates in the city's levee system, fearing that Andrew's storm surge could overtop the defenses. In bayou communities, residents lashed down boats, boarded windows, and fled inland as the storm churned closer. Andrew's second U.S. landfall came in the early hours of Wednesday, August 26, 1992, at around 3:30 a.m. Central Time in St. Mary Parish, Louisiana, about 20 miles west-southwest of Morgan City, raking the coast with the storm's eastern eye wall. And by landfall, Andrew had weakened slightly back to a strong Category 3 with sustained winds near 115 miles per hour and a central pressure of 956 millibars. In the Atchafalaya Basin, the hurricane's eye moved inland over marshes and swamps, sparing New Orleans a direct hit. Still, the surrounding Cajun country bore the brunt. Storm surge up to 8 feet flooded low-lying areas from Vermilion Bay eastward to Lake Bourne. Andrew's forward speed had slowed to just 10 miles per hour, a sharp change from its rapid Florida crossing. And that slower pace allowed the hurricane to wring itself out over Louisiana. Rainfall totals topped 11 inches in spots, with localized flooding across eastern Louisiana and southern Mississippi. Towns like Morgan City and Franklin suffered extensive wind damage. Cars were overturned, boats were thrown inland, and homes were stripped of roofs or reduced to skeletal frames. Further north, power lines snapped like matchsticks. Baton Rouge and Lafayette were plunged into darkness, and smaller towns endured days, even weeks, without electricity. By the time Andrew's remnants curved northeastward into Mississippi and the Tennessee Valley, the damage tally in Louisiana had climbed to roughly $1 billion. Official accounts attribute 8 direct deaths to Andrew's Louisiana landfall, with 9 more indirect fatalities from accidents, medical emergencies, and post-storm hazards. 2 days after landfall, on August 28th, Andrew's remnants merged with an approaching cold front over the mid-Atlantic states. The storm that had struck Florida like a buzzsaw and hammered Louisiana was finally gone, but in its wake lay 2 battered states, each beginning the long process of recovery. When the winds finally fell silent and the first light of August 24th crept over South Florida, the world that its residents had known was gone. In Miami-Dade County alone, an estimated 250,000 people were suddenly left homeless. Entire neighborhoods had homes flattened to just their bare concrete slabs. Families stumbled through streets choked with debris, the air thick with dust and smell of splintered wood, ruptured gas lines, and brackish floodwater. Many had nothing left but the clothes on their backs. The scale of destruction defied comprehension. Across Andrew's path, more than 63,500 houses were destroyed and 124,000 damaged. In Homestead, 99% of mobile homes were simply gone. Businesses, they fared no better. Over 7,800 were destroyed, along with 90% of the 2,100 small businesses in South Dade County. Iconic landmarks vanished. The Cutler Ridge Mall was reduced to skeletal steel, and the municipal power grid in Homestead and Florida City was completely annihilated. In total, more than 1.3 million people in South Florida lost electricity, some for over 7 weeks. Telephone and water services failed across vast areas, cutting off entire communities. Yet, some refused to leave, camping in the ruins beneath torn roofs and leaning walls, determined to protect what little was left. Others crowded into hastily established shelters, school gymnasiums, churches, clutching plastic bags of salvaged possessions. Overnight, the most basic necessities had become scarce. In the late August heat, with days topping 90 degrees, humidity hanging like a wet shroud, the loss of power meant no air conditioning, no refrigeration, and no way to preserve food and limited means to communicate with the outside world. In those first sweltering days, survival became an improvisation. Freezers thawed and communities held cookouts in the streets to use what they could before it spoiled. Propane grills, charcoal pits, and camping stoves became lifelines. Daily life revolved around finding water, ice, gasoline, anything to keep going another day. And yet, amid the wreckage, neighbors became each other's lifelines. People shared generators, supplies, and information. Those with intact roofs took in displaced families. The injured poured into hospitals, many hurt not in the storm itself, but in the hazardous work of clearing wreckage. And still, the storm's speed and the evacuations had saved lives. 15 people died in South Florida directly from Andrew's winds, flying debris, or collapsing structures, with dozens more lost indirectly in the weeks that followed. Many survivors surveying the ruin echoed the same refrain: it could have been so much worse. In the earliest hours, local and state responders scrambled to organize relief, but the scale of the disaster quickly overwhelmed them. Governor Lawton Chiles mobilized every available National Guard unit. Food, water, and ice distribution points were established, but in those first days, they were far too few. Desperation would grow, and on live television, Miami-Dade County Emergency Management Chief Kate Hale delivered a raw, unforgettable plea.
Where in the hell is the cavalry on this one?
Her words reverberated across the country and up the chain of command. And within 24 hours, President George H.W. Bush ordered thousands of active duty troops into the disaster zone. The 82nd Airborne Division arrived with tents, field kitchens, engineers, and medical teams, joining FEMA's efforts in finally bringing visible relief. And yet, Andrew's devastation did not stop with homes and lives. The storm unleashed an unprecedented crisis in Florida's insurance market. $16 billion in insured losses bankrupted 8 companies outright and drove dozens more to the brink. The shock forced sweeping reforms. The economic cost was equally grim. Agriculture suffered over $1 billion in damage statewide, with Miami-Dade County losing 85% of its fruit crops and $206 million in ornamental nursery stock. An estimated 86,000 Floridians lost their jobs, and in Miami-Dade alone, 120,000 positions vanished in a single day. Life became defined in 2 eras, before Andrew and after Andrew. Years later, some survivors still flinch at the sound of thunder, their minds pulled back to that night of screaming wind and splintering walls. The storm's scars on people, infrastructure, economy, and landscape would take decades to fade. And in its wake, Andrew left a lasting truth. Even a single hurricane can forever alter the course of a place and its people. When Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida in August of 1992, it did far more than topple buildings and uproot trees. It exposed flaws in how the state's communities had been built, insured, and protected. What followed was not just a recovery effort, but a fundamental rethinking of Florida's relationship with hurricanes. The storm became a pivot point, forcing policy changes that would ripple through the decades and redefine the state's engineering and emergency planning requirements. One of Andrew's most lasting legacies was its transformation of Florida's building codes. Before the storm, the state's approach to construction was fragmented. Each county and each municipality had their own system, leading to more than 400 separate local building codes in effect across the state, with many being outdated and/or poorly enforced. In Miami-Dade County, grand jury investigations confirmed what residents already suspected. Too many homes had fallen not just because of Andrew's raw power, but because of how they were built. They were built by using cutting corners and using cheap materials, and suffered from a lack of oversight. Roofs had been fastened with inadequate straps. Garage doors, often the first breach in a home, had no wind resistance. Concrete block walls lacked reinforcement. Andrew's winds simply found these weaknesses and tore the entire structures apart. The public was outraged at these findings and demanded reforms, which actually came pretty quickly. In the years after Andrew, all South Florida counties, spearheaded by Miami-Dade, enacted the toughest wind resistance standards in the nation, requiring hurricane straps, reinforced masonry, impact-rated glass or hurricane shutters, and stricter inspection protocols. And in 1996, the Florida legislature created the Building Code Study Commission to take a fresh look at the state's building rules and suggest improvements. After 16 months of review, the commission found a messy system. More than 400 local governments and state agencies, each with their own building codes and applied and enforced in different ways. One big problem was that many builders just weren't following the rules consistently. So the commission recommended creating one clear set of building codes for the whole state, making sure they were enforced in the same way everywhere, and improving training and education so everyone understood and followed them. In 1998, lawmakers approved these changes and authorized the newly created Florida Building Commission to create a single statewide building code that local governments would enforce. And in 2002, the Building Commission adopted and implemented the modern-day code we still more or less use today. This unified standards statewide and mandated hurricane-specific reinforcements in what we call the high-velocity wind zones, covering the entire state. Developers balked at first, citing costs. Yet, in later storms, the system showed that it worked, as homes built to the new stringent post-Andrew standards routinely survived with less damage than their non-reinforced counterparts, vindicating these reforms. The lessons of Andrew were literally cemented into Florida's roofs and walls. The insurance industry faced an equally seismic shock. Andrew's 15 to 20 billion in insured losses, the largest in U.S. history at the time, bankrupted at least 16 companies. National carriers retreated from coastal markets, premiums soared, and thousands of homeowners suddenly found themselves uninsurable. The state had to step in, creating the Florida Windstorm Underwriting Association and the Residential Property and Casualty Joint Underwriting Association as insurers of last resort. And a decade later, these merged into what we now know as Citizens Property Insurance Corporation, which still shoulders that role today. Just as importantly, Andrew forced the insurance world to abandon complacency. Before 1992, catastrophe modeling was primitive and often underestimated the impact of a major storm on a metro area. And after Andrew, sophisticated CAD models became standard, pricing policies based on realistic worst-case scenarios. These reforms kept the market from collapsing entirely, but as we all know, Florida's insurance sector never returned to its pre-Andrew stability. Even now, the echoes of that crisis still reverberate in soaring premiums and industry volatility throughout the state. If Andrew's winds shredded homes, its aftermath shredded the reputation of the nation's disaster preparedness system. In 1992, FEMA was slow, disorganized, and unprepared for an urban Cat 5 strike. And in the chaos, local and state officials were overwhelmed. Television screens across the country broadcasted the frustration of local leaders. The public outcry became a political flashpoint, influencing the 1992 presidential election and spurring systemic change. Under President Clinton, FEMA was overhauled by a new director, James Lee Witt, who pushed the agency to become proactive rather than reactive, integrating disaster planning, pre-positioning supplies, and forging stronger coordination with state and local authorities. Meanwhile, in Florida, The state's Division of Emergency Management was strengthened, communication redundancies were built in, and public hurricane education campaigns became a permanent fixture of the seasonal calendar. The mantra, "It only takes one storm," became embedded into the state's culture. But perhaps Andrew's most profound impact was on the people in the communities of South Florida. More than 350,000 people were forced from their homes, tens of thousands of whom would just never return, accelerating demographic shifts as families moved north into Broward and Palm Beach counties. In places like Homestead and Florida City, whole neighborhoods were erased. But amid the rubble, however, came resilience. Volunteer brigades sprang up overnight, directing traffic where signals were gone, delivering water, setting up makeshift cookouts to feed entire blocks with thawing freezer food before it spoiled in the sweltering heat. Aid would pour in from across the nation, from church groups to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who had helped remove mountains of debris, built temporary housing, and restored crippling utilities. Andrew's fury reshaped not just Florida's building and policies, but the collective psyche of Floridians. It showed in painful clarity the upper limits of what a hurricane can do to a modern metropolitan area, and how unprepared even the wealthiest of communities can be when nature tests their limits. 30 years later, the lessons learned from Andrew's destruction live on in the daily lives of all Floridians, written in our concrete, glass, and steel. Because of Andrew, our homes stand stronger, response teams mobilize faster, and communities prepare earlier. Andrew did not just change Florida, it reinvented Florida. Out of the destroyed homes in South Miami-Dade rose walls of concrete strapped with steel, and out of political failure came swift, coordinated response. And yet, out of loss came a hardened resolve. Andrew's winds may have long since faded, but their echoes here in Florida still shape every home built, every evacuation order given, and every Floridian who remembers, it only takes one. Hey guys, thank you so much for checking out my channel. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell so you don't miss more content like these. Thanks again, CJ, Florida Man Weather.